All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to all of our guests. For those who are first time joining us here at Americans United for our summer series, and those who are returning for their second, third, or fourth, or in some cases fifth Tuesday in June with Americans United. My name is Sarah Gillooly, and I'm the Vice President of State Outreach and Engagement at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Every Tuesday in June, we've been bringing you experts from across the movement for separation of religion and government. Over the course of the month, we've heard from Catherine Stewart about her new book, from Rob Boston of AU about the history of religious freedom in our country, as well as a range of other speakers speaking about different subjects. And we are delighted to be rounding out the series, rounding out the month of the AU Summer Series with a presentation by AU Summer Interns about school vouchers and justice issues. It couldn't be a more timely topic. It couldn't be a more exciting day for our interns to be coming to you on the heels of an incredibly important decision from the Supreme Court on vouchers. You'll hear more about that from our interns, and I have a few technical notes before we get started. If you have a question today, please drop that in the Q&A. If you look on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. You can click on it and put your questions there, and we'll get to as many questions we can at the end of our hour together. If you'd like to chat with our hosts, with our AU staff, please do so in the chat box. Rose, who you'll be introduced to in a moment, will be in the chat box with all of you today. In addition, we are delighted to be offering closed captioning on this webinar, as AU is constantly looking for ways to deepen our own commitments to accessibility. So if closed captioning would be valuable for you, please just look on the bottom of the screen and click through that closed captioning box. And we're having live closed captioning today. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to our interns. I'll be joining you at the very end. This webinar will be recorded. It will be placed on the AU website at au.org/summer series, and we'll have it up hopefully within about 24 hours. So I'm going to turn it over to Callie and to Lily and to Rose and let them introduce themselves to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Sarah. I'm so excited to get this webinar started. It's one of my big projects this summer. So my name is Lily. I use pronouns like she, her, and hers. I'm a recent graduate of Sarah Lawrence College and an organizing intern with Americans United. I'm really, really excited to bring this project to fruition. I'm really excited to bring disability justice to a forefront of an AU conversation.
Hi all, I'm Callie. I also use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a student at Georgetown Law School and AU's litigation intern this summer, and I'm passionate about LGBTQ+ rights in education.
Hi, my name is Rose Rickmeyer. I will be moderating this Q&A. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm graduating from American University this summer with an undergraduate degree, and I am the fundraising intern for Americans United this summer.
So also joining us later on this call, we're going to have Elise Aguilar, who is our federal policy counsel and voucher expert. We also want to make sure that everybody knows that closed captioning is available. If you click on closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom functions, you should be able to get pretty accurate closed captions on what's going on in the webinar. The one thing that we really want everyone to know is that Espinoza did come out today. It's been a really busy day at Americans United, and so we're still unpacking the implications of this ruling. We're going to discuss a little bit about what Espinoza means later on in the webinar. We ask that people, if possible, hold off on their questions until later. And we want to make sure that we can focus our efforts on answering questions we haven't gotten to yet when we discuss the ruling. We also do want to stress the way that we just found out about the ruling. It's only 5 hours old, so there's a lot of things that we just don't know yet. It usually takes the Americans United legal team at least a day to fully unpack what all of this means. But we encourage everybody to keep tabs on Americans United and follow up with our social media, because more and more will come out in the preceding days.
So the topic for today's summer series generally is the discriminatory effect of school voucher programs, especially on disabled and LGBTQ+ students, and how students are able to push back against this. So Lily's going to start us off with some basic definitions. Oh, Lily, you gotta unmute.
Thank you. So thank you, Sarah, for putting the presentation up. The first thing that we need to show is what a voucher is and what a voucher does. Very simply, a traditional voucher is a scholarship from the government to attend the private school of your choice. The government writes a check, you go to private school. There's also such thing as a tax credit program. And what that does is gives you a tax credit to individuals and corporations that donate to organizations that provide scholarships for students to attend private school. These usually show up when you see something like a scholarship fund.
In the 1950s and 1960s, school vouchers were used by white families to avoid racially integrating public schools, subsidizing what we now call segregation academies. In 2002, the Supreme Court decided Zelman v. Simmons-Harris, which held that state-funded vouchers can go to private religious schools as long as it's the families determining where to spend their vouchers and not the government directly. This is allowed even if the overwhelming majority of the choices are religious schools, and even not that many different religions. For example, in Indiana, more than 90% of the schools participating in the state voucher program are Christian schools. In the 2017-2018 school year, 10% of all elementary and secondary students in America were at private schools. That's almost 6 million students, over 4 million of whom were either at a Catholic or other religious school. And over 500,000 students now receive some form of public assistance to attend private school, whether that's an educational savings account, a traditional voucher like Lily just explained, or a tax credit scholarship. Those latter two are the largest categories. Religious schools often charge far less in tuition than secular private schools as well, so families receiving less than a full scholarship are encouraged to choose a religious school because it's the more affordable option. On the next slide, these 30 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, have some form of a voucher, tax credit, or educational savings account program. States with numbers beside them have multiple programs. So take just a moment to see if your state has a voucher program. We will come back to this slide. And before we really get into it, there's some additional vocabulary that's going to come up. We'll give some quick definitions now and develop them more throughout, but please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A if you'd like us to explore them further. No-aid clauses, they're also known as Blaine amendments, are provisions in state constitutions that explicitly bar tax assistance to religious schools. Over 35 states have some form of a no-aid clause. Some of these states also have voucher programs. We'll get more into that intersection later. The First Amendment has two relevant clauses for us. The Free Exercise Clause forbids the government from unduly burdening religious practice, and the Establishment Clause forbids the government from advancing any particular religion. However, the government can sometimes operate in what is known as the play between the joints of these two clauses without violating either of them. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, is a 1993 law holding that neutral federal laws of general applicability cannot burden free exercise unless they are the least restrictive means of furthering a compelling government interest.
So two super important pieces of legislation that we need to go over before we talk about disability justice is the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's the ADA, and the Individuals with Disability Education Act, that's IDEA. Two of these, they're two groundbreaking pieces of legislation. They were passed in their first iterations in 1990 and 1975, respectively. And both of them outline the rights of disabled people. IDEA is specifically about schools and education. So we need to talk about why vouchers are a fundamentally flawed system. Vouchers are against AU's mission. They violate principles of separation in church and state. So AU believes that public dollars need to fund public schools, and we oppose vouchers in any form. Vouchers fail many students on many levels, especially students with disabilities, LGBT+ students, rural students, and low-income students. And private schools aren't necessarily held to the same standards as public schools either. So one clear and shocking example of this is that from 2004 to 2014, the state of Wisconsin gave $139 million to schools that were then barred from the voucher program because they failed to meet some really basic standards in issues like finances, safety, and accreditation.
Like Lily said, private religious schools are exempt from most non-discrimination laws, so they can legally reject or expel students for being gay or disabled. For example, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act offers some protection from discrimination based only on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance, but that doesn't include sex and hasn't even entirely eliminated racial discrimination in private schools. Additionally, less than half of the currently operating voucher programs provide protections in their enabling statutes for discrimination based on race, religion, sex, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Less than half of voucher programs have those protections in the statutes that have established the voucher programs.
So something really important to understand as we discuss these is that people don't just inhabit one identity. Many people are double vulnerable to multiple discriminations. So when we in this talk focus on disability and LGBT issues, we also need to understand is that there are many, many disabled students who have LGBT+ identities. And permitting voucher schools to discriminate puts federal funding towards harming the most vulnerable people in our society. So when we talk about disability, we need to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Something really important to understand is that private schools are allowed to reject students based on a disability. Many students who are offered voucher funding initially actually end up rejecting it because they can't find a school that accommodated their needs. A good portion, over 20% of DC parents who rejected vouchers, did it because they thought that schools lacked the special needs services that their children need. And a further 12% of the parents who accepted the voucher ended up having to leave the program because they felt that the school they had chosen lacked the special needs services that their child needed. Schools also end up partnering with local public schools anyway, because many of the private schools can't offer specific therapies or curriculum that students might need. So what we end up doing is giving funding to private schools who end up leaning on our public schools anyway to provide essential services for students with disabilities. Within the ADA, religious institutions, including schools, are exempt from the ADA. That means that they can maintain facilities and curriculums that are at best unwelcoming and at worst discriminatory. So when AU looked at some DC schools, they found that almost 50% of these participating schools had limited or no access to a wheelchair. When we talk about limited accessibility, that means that, for example, access might only be limited to the first floor of a building or exist for some grades only. So then we have to ask the question, what happens, for example, when a student might advance from 6th to 7th grade and all of a sudden can't participate in their classes along with their peers? It's discriminatory and it's also upsetting and disruptive to a student's education. When we're talking about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we need to establish that a student receives what's called a free and appropriate public education. What that means is that students are entitled to the least restrictive and most inclusive education in the most integrated way possible. Students receive an individualized education plan, or IEP. In some cases, IEP teams decide that a student's best needs can be met at a private school. When a student is placed at a private school through their IEP, they do retain their rights to their free and appropriate public education. But when a student's parents place them in a private school, even through voucher funding, students in only a few select states can retain those rights. In addition, the private school educators don't necessarily need to have any kind of special education credentials or be held accountable in the same way that a public school teacher would.
Shifting to gender and sexuality, religious private schools are largely exempt from Title IX sex discrimination laws to the extent that application of Title IX would be inconsistent with the religious tenets of the organization. That inconsistency is determined by the religious institution and verified with the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights using RFRA as a benchmark. Now, Title IX and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act are often read harmoniously, meaning that the new Title VII decisions in Bostock v. Clayton County extending employment anti-discrimination laws to cover sexual orientation and gender identity, an amazing decision, should lead to more inclusive policies in public schools regarding things like bathroom access for trans students. But this does not extend to private religious schools. And if the statute establishing the voucher program doesn't also include protections against sex discrimination, students who face sex discrimination have limited legal recourse. They might not be able to sue at all. In 2017, HuffPost found that at least 14% of religious schools take an active stance against LGBTQ+ staff and students, ranging from public opinions comparing homosexuality to bestiality, to threatened penalties like expulsion for displaying signs of a homosexual lifestyle or alternate gender identity. Many schools have policies that students must agree to that read something like this: I choose not to engage in, embrace, or promote promiscuity, homosexual/bisexual behaviors, or any other biblical violation of the unique roles of males or females. These policies have really damaging implications. For example, trans students may not be able to access bathrooms of their choice. Trans students would be unable to develop a sense of style through normal modes of expression like hairstyle and clothing. They would experience amplified gender dysphoria when forced into strict gender roles that they do not personally identify with. Queer students in general are not allowed to be in open relationships. They're not allowed to explore dating and sexuality like their heterosexual peers. Sometimes they're not allowed to participate in normal school activities like overnight stays for athletic or theater competitions. There is the constant threat of outing for closeted students, and some LGBTQ+ students are even subjected to conversion therapy, which is a largely discredited and extremely harmful practice. Additionally, these private religious schools often offer no sex education or blatantly incorrect sex education, including teachings like abstinence only, fear-mongering, no mention or extreme mischaracterizations of sexually transmitted diseases, no mention of sexual orientation or gender identity at all, etc. And these policies are harmful to all students, not even LGBTQ+ students, but all students who don't understand what they're going through physically and emotionally, or how to have a positive relationship with their bodies. And this discrimination extends past LGBTQ+ students to parents and teachers as well. Students with LGBTQ+ parents can be denied admission or expelled when the schools learn of their parents' identities. And these policies discourage LGBTQ+ teachers from working at private religious schools to begin with, which means fewer good role models for LGBTQ+ students struggling with their identities. A theater teacher in my hometown in Florida was fired last fall from a Christian school when the school found out she was in a relationship with a woman. I grew up in that town doing theater at my school, and as a queer student that came out to my friends in high school, that would have crushed me. All of these obstacles limit equal access to education for LGBTQ+ students. And this discrimination affects other marginalized communities as well. Despite Title VI's protections against race discrimination, private religious schools still discriminate against Black students with alarming frequency based on their hairstyles. For example, school policies against dreadlocks or afros mean that Black students can be turned away at the door. And like Lily said earlier, these identities intersect. Students who are Black and trans and disabled are some of the most vulnerable members of our society. And in many cases, private schools either cannot or will not meet these students' needs.
So at the crux of the issue, we find vouchers. Vouchers funnel money away from public schools that could be used to help students who are in more vulnerable categories achieve what they need to achieve. Public schools can, and many times, meet students' needs, and private schools are not necessarily accountable to state educational standards. When I was looking into this, I found that voucher funding doesn't improve academic performances for most students. And in many cases, like when I looked into Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio, students ended up performing worse in voucher schools. In Alabama, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and DC, students in voucher programs didn't do any better in comparison to their peers outside of voucher programs. And many of these programs teach blatantly wrong or religious curriculum. I found a lot of creationism, intelligence design, field trips to Christian museums that argued against dinosaurs and bacteria. There's also some just blatantly wrong history. The Bob Jones University Press history textbooks, which are used in many Christian schools, famously taught facts like, and this is a quote, that the majority of slaveholders treated their slaves well, and that the Klan fought a decline in morality by using the cross and targeted bootleggers, wife beaters, and immoral movies. Teachers are often under-equipped to teach their subject matter. This can also be a problem in public schools as well, and speaks largely to how we have systematically devalued education and teachers in our society. But also specifically in private schools, teachers aren't often required to have more than a bachelor's degree, and they're especially under-equipped to serve disabled students. These schools can also perpetuate class equality. While theoretically, vouchers give everybody the right to attend a private school, they don't necessarily cover all of the costs, and that might be things like gifted or AP dual enrollment, and even transportation. These issues can compound for students in multiple vulnerable groups. So for example, a rural and low-income student might have a limited choice of voucher school and be forced to undertake a long and expensive commute to attend a school that's supposed to help them. They also end up subsidizing wealthier students' education because voucher funding rarely covers the entire cost of private school tuition, and that leaves parents to pick up the rest. So what that means is that vouchers end up helping mostly wealthier students who are able to cover the difference between voucher funding and the true cost of a private school.
Recently also, Betsy DeVos used a coronavirus aid bill to funnel even more money to private schools based on the total number of students enrolled at those schools. That includes wealthy students who can afford to pay full tuition rather than allocating the aid to schools that serve larger low-income populations. And stepping back to look at the big picture, when the government allows for an erosion of civil rights in one area like education, that necessarily spills out to other areas, and the impact is compounded when it's funded by public tax dollars. And students at these schools learn that it is appropriate to discriminate against people who do not share your religious views or your beliefs about gender and sexuality. Now, we're going to shift focus and talk about the recent Supreme Court cases, which is the moment everyone's been waiting for since we received the Espinoza decision this morning. And unfortunately, as you probably know at this point, that decision was not in our favor. For some background on the case, Montana is one of the states with a no-aid clause preventing it from funding religious schools. In 2018, the Montana Supreme Court struck down the state's tax credit voucher program because it forced residents to pay for religious education in violation of that no-aid clause. Their voucher program had 94% of taxpayer-funded vouchers going to private religious schools, and 10 of the 12 religious schools in the voucher program had discriminatory policies like those I talked about earlier. In a 5-4 decision today, the court held that excluding religious schools from the voucher program because of their religious status violates the free exercise clause. This ruling is a setback for the separation of church and state, but it's far from the end of the fight. While the court held that religious schools cannot be categorically blocked from voucher programs based on their religious status, the court did not decide whether states are free to prohibit program funds from being used for religious instruction or activities at private schools that accept vouchers. For example, another Supreme Court case a few years ago upheld a scholarship program that excluded students pursuing theology degrees. The decision today in Espinoza did not overrule that case. That was Locke v. Davey. The Supreme Court's decision today also does not address whether a state may refuse to fund religious schools that discriminate in their admissions or employment based on protected characteristics like race, religion, sex, or disability. These questions will be resolved by future litigation. It's important to keep an eye on them because Espinoza is not the end of the fight. We're also still waiting on a decision in Our Lady of Guadalupe School versus Morrissey Baru. Federal anti-discrimination law already allows religious employers to discriminate based on religion, so a Catholic school can ensure its teachers are Catholic. But the ministerial exception exempts religious institutions from all employment non-discrimination laws as applied to their ministers or faith leaders. If the court considers the teachers in Our Lady of Guadalupe School versus Morrissey Baru to be ministers, then teachers at religious schools could legally be fired for their gender, their age, their disability, their sexuality, etc. There are approximately 300,000 lay teachers at religious schools in the United States that could lose their civil rights in employment based on this ruling alone. That number gets even higher when you add janitors, nurses, administrative assistants at these religious schools. If anyone who leads a prayer is considered a minister, the school could assign prayer duties to all its employees in order to legally discriminate against everyone that it employs, not just actual ministers. Combined with Espinoza, a bad ruling in Morrissey Beru would result in taxpayers being compelled to fund religious schools that discriminate against their students and their employees. So, if you're now as outraged about vouchers funding discrimination as we are, there are things you can do to help. We don't need to wait for the Supreme Court to give us our rights. There are 2 bills specifically to advocate for in Congress. The Equality Act would provide comprehensive protections for LGBTQ+ people in employment, housing, and public accommodations, and wouldn't allow religious exceptions to discriminate. I'll drop a link in the chat in a second to the Human Rights Campaign actually has a very good website on how to advocate for the Equality Act. And the Do No Harm Act would amend RFRA to protect civil rights and otherwise prevent meaningful harm to third parties and for other purposes. It has 3 clauses in ways it would amend RFRA. The first is that RFRA should not be interpreted to authorize an exemption from generally applicable law that imposes the religious views, habits, or practices of one party upon another. RFRA should not be interpreted to authorize an exemption from generally applicable law that imposes meaningful harm, including dignitary harm, on a third party. That's the second. And the third is that RFRA should not be interpreted to authorize an exemption that permits discrimination against other persons, including persons who do not belong to the religion or adhere to the beliefs of those to whom the exemption is given. NAU has our very own link on how to advocate for the Do No Harm Act, so I'll drop both of those in the chat in just a moment. Very common sense amendments to RFRA, but in the face of the discrimination we're seeing today, they're important to add very specifically and very explicitly. And additionally, the Espinoza decision only applies to states that have voucher programs. If a state does not have a voucher program, it is not required to fund religious education. Therefore, the best thing to do is to avoid funding of private education entirely. Public money should go to public schools that benefit everyone.
More generally, look up your state voucher program. Call your representatives and advocate for us to reinvest in our public schools. With the money that we've been funneling towards private schools, we can work towards giving every student what they need. Educate yourself and your community about voucher funding and the issues therein. Parents and teachers and students should and must know their rights. We also want to call for accountability on voucher schools. Schools that receive public dollars should be publicly accountable for what they receive, what they spend, and how. We need to require schools that accept voucher funding to conform to regulations on disability inclusion. If you receive public dollars that should have gone to public schools, you should be held to the same standard as public schools. This means that private schools must be accredited, accessible, and have faculty and staff who are equipped to educate and interact with disabled students in a respectful way. Most of all, we want to advocate to limit and end voucher programs in our communities and nationwide. What vouchers allow us, the government, to do is invest in discrimination and exclusion with our tax dollars. So if we want to go to that last slide, here are the states that have vouchers, tax credits, or educational savings accounts. I highly encourage people to quickly look through the list and to find their state, see if this is something that you can call your representative about or start organizing your local Americans United chapter around. We're going to start opening up to questions, which Rose will moderate, and Elise will join us on to answer some of our more specific policy questions.
Hi all, once again, my name is Rose. I'm moderating the Q&A chat box. Our first question is from Robert Higgins, and he asks, are the private religious schools that will be lining up for taxpayer-funded vouchers students also tax exempt? For example, do they pay property taxes?
That is a good question. I don't personally know the answer to. Elise, do you have any idea about the tax exempt nature of those institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right, they're tax exempt, especially a lot of times when you think about more traditional parochial schools, they are part of or are connected to a house of worship. And so if you think about all the exemptions that houses of worship get as well, if you think about them all being tied together, there's a lot of sort of like a black box, I think, sometimes in terms of accountability, in terms of oversight, in terms of the exemptions that they get. So you're absolutely right in suggesting that they are tax exempt.
I'm going to use my host prerogative to hop on and ask a live question. So when we started this webinar series, we left a sort of blank, a hole at the end of the 5, and said, we'll let our interns choose the topic that is most exciting and enlivening and interesting to them. So I'd love to hear from Lily and Callie, why this subject? What brought you to the subject of vouchers and disability justice for this webinar?
Sure, I can start, and then Callie, I'll pass the baton off to you. So both disability justice and LGBT plus justice are something that's touched my lives in very, very personal ways. And when we talk about young people, one of the very, very common things that we all share, and one of the very, very few things that we all share, is that most American young people are students, at least until the age of 16, but many, many people continue onward to complete high school degrees and then bachelor's degrees. So one of the great uniting things that we can focus and fight around are the issue of vouchers and discrimination.
Yeah, and when I heard that Lily wanted to talk about vouchers and disability justice, that was something I immediately latched onto as well, because I'm familiar and getting more familiar by the day with how vouchers discriminate against LGBTQ plus students. I think I mentioned this earlier, I'm from Florida. There are currently 5 different kinds of voucher programs in Florida. And I had read last fall about that one professor in my hometown being fired simply because she's gay at a school that does accept vouchers. And the Orlando Sentinel has actually published some really impressive articles on the amount of schools receiving voucher programs that discriminate against LGBT plus students and how much money they're receiving. I believe it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars at over 100 schools that have discriminatory policies. So I thought that this was a really good approach to take with Lily, where we could kind of examine how this affects 2 communities specifically and the intersections of them.
Thanks, guys. Another question that's coming in is people are wondering what brought you all to AU to be interns? What made you want to intern for Americans United?
Sure, so we'll do the same thing. I'll pass the baton to you, Callie, after I'm done. I found this through a fund at my school at Sarah Lawrence College, where I recently graduated from. I'd actually applied to this internship my freshman year and was rejected. And so it's really nice to come full circle and do what I've always wanted to do, which is advocate for progressive change on every level. What I think I value so much about this and this internship is that Americans United is really not afraid to take progressive stances, but also to advocate for religious freedom and not just against religion in general. I think a lot of the times when I talk to people about separation of church and state, what I hear them say is that means no religion at all. And so I feel really proud that I work for an organization that might say, actually, we believe that all students should be able to practice their religion freely in a public school, that we can't prohibit, for example, a Muslim student from wearing a hijab because that would be an infringement on their religious freedom. Our President Rachel talks a lot about how religious freedom should be a shield and not a sword, and that's something that I've started to carry with me and that I believe in very strongly.
Yeah, I actually just wrote a blog post about this that went up on AU's website. So if you want to know more about like my AU origin story, it's there. But I learned about AU in 2018, actually, in my senior year of undergrad, when the president of my college was considering giving an exemption from our non-discrimination policy to an evangelical organization that didn't want LGBTQ plus students to be leaders in their club. I am both queer and Christian, so that really rubbed me the wrong way. I found it blatantly discriminatory, and I was really upset by what was happening, and really happy to discover that an organization like AU exists that challenges these misconceptions and shows that religion doesn't have to discriminate and shouldn't discriminate. So my fiance actually, who was watching, hi Sienna, reached out to AU, to Sam Sokol in our policy department. And she got back with some advice that helped us win the fight against our college president. He agreed that the non-discrimination policy should stay as it is, no exemptions, no carve-outs. And then as a first-year law student, when I was looking for places I could intern for the summer after my first year, Americans United was top of the list alphabetically. And I was also extremely excited to see it because we'd already worked with them. So I applied and I got here and I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks for sharing. Those were really inspirational, really inspiring. Following up on Lily's point, how can people advocate against vouchers without sounding anti-religious or without being misunderstood as being anti-religious?
I think that's a question that's something good to think on, because I think many people, particularly the religious right, would like to believe that they're being persecuted for their religion. And so what I think would be incredibly important is to point out that this applies to all religious schools, and not just religious schools, but private schools in general. I'm not just against voucher funding for religious schools, I'm against voucher funding for secular schools as well. And these schools would apply, or these vouchers shouldn't go to a Jewish yeshiva, for example, or a Muslim school. I really strongly encourage people to make sure that when they're talking about private schools and voucher funding issues, that they make sure that they're emphasizing the fact that vouchers in general are bad for students. Yes, there is an issue involved in the separation of church and state, but above all, vouchers harm students because they limit their ability to succeed and to achieve.
And jumping on that, I think it's important also to just flip the narrative. Being against these voucher programs isn't about being against religion. It's about being for students, students who are disabled, students who are Black, students who are LGBTQ+. Those students aren't receiving the educational opportunities they need at private schools, and specifically private religious schools. Public schools already exist as an institution that is there to provide education to everyone. So it doesn't make sense to funnel off those resources to schools that don't provide those and don't need to provide those.
I'll just jump in really quickly too, even though those were great answers. Just from an advocacy perspective, just to point out the fact that we do have a lot of religious groups that are on our side that oppose private school vouchers. So I think a lot of times it's pitted as religion versus secular groups, but that's not necessarily true, especially if you think about more traditional groups. For instance, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty is one of our greatest allies on fighting against private school vouchers. And, you know, they see the separation of religion and government as being, as we do, as being good for both religion and government. And, you know, when there is funding going to religious schools through vouchers, there should be strings attached to that. So, you know, that opens up religious schools to things like government interference, government audits, the government telling the schools what they can and cannot do. And so that type of interference is unwarranted and not wanted by a lot of religious organizations and religious schools. So I think this is an example of sort of the minority of groups asking for this happen to be the loudest voices in the room, but don't necessarily represent what religious organizations and schools necessarily want more broadly.
Thank you. The next question is for Callie. As a gay Christian, do you engage in dialogue with anti-LGBTQ Christians? And if you do, how do you engage in that conversation?
Good question. I will say I don't actively seek it out. I don't usually want that kind of negativity in my life, but sometimes it does find me. I have a few family members on my mom's side that have decided they would not like to come to my wedding next year because they believe it goes against their biblical values, but I'm mostly letting my mom handle those conversations. I will say, because I don't participate as much in organized church and religion anymore. I am not the theological expert on here is why LGBTQ plus people should be included in Christianity specifically, but I did attend an amazing conference my senior year of college while that non-discrimination policy issue was happening, called the Reformation Project. It's hosted by a man, I believe his name is Matthew Vines, who is a biblical theological expert that has gone through the history of the Bible in various translations and has broken down a lot of the most common misconceptions about the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. The Bible says we have man and we have woman. And attending some of those talks was really insightful, but I was really just impressed with the environment of being in a very Christian environment, being in a church, that the whole conference was hosted in a church, and not feeling like I had to hide any part of myself. I think the values that draw me to Christianity are love and acceptance and inclusion. Those are the values I try to put forth in the world. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that is how I approach those situations when I find myself in them.
Thank you so much for answering that question and opening up. That was really great. The next question for Elise. Would you be able to tell us more about what might be next on vouchers in the States after the Espinoza ruling?
Sure. I think we are very concerned that the Espinoza ruling will open up more voucher programs in the states, either the creation of new programs or states that already have voucher programs that are tuition tax credit programs or not more traditional type of vouchers might expand and create more traditional type voucher programs. So I think we're expecting to see states that have no-aid clauses similar to the no-aid clause that was at issue in the Espinoza case in Montana, for there to be increased litigation in those states, either where those states have said that our no-aid clause bars vouchers or some form of vouchers, or just opening the door for legislators to push those and feel really emboldened by the Espinoza decision to push for vouchers in their states. So we are very, very concerned about the implications for expansion across the states.
All right, so with that, we are going to bring our webinar to a little bit of a close. Thank you so much to everybody who attended. It's really heartening to see so many people who care not only about separation of church and state, but also about how young people specifically are impacted by a lack of separation between church and state. Thank you so much to Callie, who helped me develop a huge portion of this webinar and did some fantastic research, and to Rose, who moderated and did a fantastic job, and also to Elise, who on this very, very, very busy day donated her time and energy to help us educate the public. So I'm going to bounce it back to Sarah, who's going to do the larger closeout, and thank you so much, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for joining us this summer over the last 5 weeks. It has been a delight to answer questions and get to know some of you in the chat, and to bring you just a broad range of topics about separation of religion and government. We hope that you'll join us in September, on September the 14th and 15th, that's a Monday and Tuesday, for AU's National Advocacy Summit. We're going virtual with the National Advocacy Summit, so we'll be bringing you live plenary sessions and keynote addresses from people like Jeff Charlotte and our own Rachel. We'll also be bringing you on-demand breakout sessions where you can click to learn on a number of topics about how to build better advocacy in your community. And we'll also be having a National Day of Action, including virtual meetings with our members of Congress. So you can go to au.org/conference and register. It's a totally free event, and we look forward to seeing you then. This webinar and all of the webinars in our summer series are available at au.org/summer series, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you so much.